In his book, The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, The Totalitarian Impulse Then and Now, Daniel Mahoney asks, quote, "Have we learned nothing from the political tragedies of the 20th century? Where is the sobriety, the moral realism that alone can give rise to mutual respect, free and decent politics, and realistic and durable change within a framework of critical respect for our country's and our civilization's admirable achievements? The fevered politics of purity and perfection are in every respect an enemy of the good, of mutual respect, and of shared liberty under the rule of law. If we don't recognize this elementary truth, and soon, we shall surely lose our civilizational soul and perhaps our freedoms too." Close quote. Daniel Mahoney on his new book, The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, Now. My name is Todd Werner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Daniel J. Mahoney is professor emeritus at Assumption University, where he taught from 1986 until 2021. Senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, senior visiting fellow at Hillsdale College, senior writer at Law and Liberty, and executive editor of Perspectives on Political Science. He has written extensively in a dozen books and over 500 articles, essays, and reviews on statesmanship, French political thought, the art and political thought of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, conservatism, religion and politics, and various themes in political philosophy. His book, The Statesman as Thinker, Portraits of Greatness, Courage, and Moderation, was awarded the Paolucci Prize for Conservative Book of the Year by ISI in 2023. His latest book, The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, The Totalitarian Impulse Then and Now, has recently been released by Encounter Books in the spring of 2025. Mahoney has written for a wide range of academic and public journals, from the Political Science Reviewer and Perspectives on Political Science to the Public Interest, the National Interest, First Things, National Review, the Claremont Review of Books, the New Criterion, Modern Age, Commentaire, La Nef, the European Conservative, and the Hungarian Review, among others. He's also edited and introduced the writings of Raymond Aron, Aurel Colnay, Pierre Manent, Bertrand de Juvenal, Joseph Cardinal Mindszenty, and the Nobel laureate Alexander Solzhenitsyn. His writings have been translated into 13 languages. In his scholarship and public writings, Mahoney vigorously defends a conservative-minded liberalism informed by classical and Christian wisdom and the best currents of moderate modernity, as well as the practical wisdom of the American founders and public-spirited statesmen such as Burke, Lincoln, Churchill, and de Gaulle. His public writings have taken eloquent and pointed aim at the totalitarian temptation in its various forms, and he is presently completing 2 books. The first, Liberty for the Good of Souls, 15 Sane Guides for a Mad World, to be published by St. Augustine's Press. And secondly, Sparks of the Spirit, a guide to the enduring wisdom and prophetic judgments of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, to be published by Creed and Culture, a new press founded by Jeremy Beer. Dan Mahoney, welcome.
Oh, great to be here, Todd. Great to be here again.
Segment 1. What is ideology? In his majestic work, The Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote, quote, "To do evil, a human being must first of all believe that what he's doing is good, or else that it's a well-considered act in conformity with natural law. Fortunately, it is in the nature of the human being to seek a justification for his actions. Macbeth's self-justifications were feeble, and his conscience devoured him. Yes, even Iago was a little lamb too. The imagination and the spiritual strength of Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short at a dozen corpses because they had no ideology." So Dan, first I want to say about your introduction, it's amazing you find time to sleep and you are the young age you are, because you're profoundly prolific and what you write is consistently of the highest quality, and it's mesmerizing. So kudos to you for the writing you do. And it's only Dan Mahoney I know that is not releasing 1 new book, but 2 basically, and probably at work on a 3rd. So congratulations. We all want your secret of how to be so prolific. The second, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, thanks very much. I'm not that young though. I'm 65. So,
well, you still have achieved. You've achieved what a guy would achieve at like 85 or 90. So good job.
Well, thank you.
So Dan, let's begin with the basic question that I think pervades this book: The Persistence of the Ideological Lie. What is ideology?
Now, the first thing I always tell people when the word ideology comes up is, I do not mean ideology as an equivalent or a substitute for perspectivalism. Perspectivalism is the view that we all speak from a certain situated perspective, that these are all partial and perhaps arbitrary and perhaps relative and equal. When I was growing up, there was a book by a husband and wife and son team called the Ebensteins.
Mm.
And it was, ideologies, liberalism, conservatism, socialism, capitalism. I don't know. You know, Look, there's some we might speak of public philosophies, we might speak of broad intellectual orientations. That's a meaningful way of speaking, because those perspectives, those ways of approaching moral and political things are often partial. That's an
Sure.
insight that goes back to the third book of Aristotle's Politics. But when I speak of ideology, I mean it as the equivalent of a form of utopian social engineering based on fundamental falsehoods about the nature of man, the nature of human beings, the human condition. And here, an insight of the great 20th century political philosopher Eric Voegelin is helpful. He spoke of ideologies as the efforts to impose a second reality
Mm.
on the only human condition we know, and that means when you read authors like George Orwell, Václav Havel, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, they all speak about this forcible imposition of a mendacious ideological grid on the real world.
Mm.
And hence, with Orwell, you need Szymon Miłosz, the great Polish Catholic poet, Nobel laureate, made the same point. Communism, he said, was a logocracy. You had to make up a linguistic
Mm.
world that bridged the gap between lies, the second reality, and the real world. Orwell spoke about newspeak and doublespeak. You're always trying to keep ahead of the lie, pretending it's not a lie while you know it's a lie. The French like to speak about the langue de bois, the wooden language. When you hear ideological language, it's artificial, it's unnatural, it's invented, it's wooden. And so I would say ideologies are they're tied to mendacity of a very high order, because they attempt to instantiate, they attempt to embody a view of human beings and a view of the world that isn't true. And it's so blatantly false that the only way of maintaining its presence in a political community, in a social order, is through what Solzhenitsyn called the twin pillars of violence and lies.
Mm.
And now those are, here I'm talking about sort of full scale ideological projects of utopian social engineering. Stalin liked to say that communism aimed to be the engineer of souls.
Mm-hmm.
Being an engineer of souls, think of that word engineer, is very different than uplifting the soul or elevating it or sanctifying grace,
Right.
helping to
Right.
transform human nature. Thomas Aquinas very interestingly says that, grace is gratuitous.
Mm.
All is grace. I think Bernard said,
Yes. Yes.
Thomas says very provocatively that grace is a gift from God, but nature has to be.
Mm.
In other words, to pretend that there is no nature and that man is defined by indefinite plasticity is at the heart of the utopian project. A similar way of putting it might be that ideology presupposes that human beings and societies can be transformed at a stroke without. And by the way, the only way human beings are really transformed is through some miraculous coming together of free will and divine grace. And that's a quite arduous path. But the idea that we seize power, we remake human beings at a stroke, we pretend, you know, I know we're going to discuss Marx later, but
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
when Marx says communism is defined by four fundamental features: the abolition of property, the abolition of family, the abolition of religion, the abolition of nature, we have to ask ourselves, is that abolition in accord with the deepest well springs of human nature?
Mm.
I think we would have to ask the same thing about gender ideology today.
Mm-hmm.
It's ideological not because it's a perspective, but because it is, to use a word that the church used to talk about, contra naturam. It is, I would say, all ideological projects are contra naturam. They are fundamentally against the deepest well springs of human nature.
Mm.
And among other things, I'll add one more trait: ideologies almost always attribute evil not to human imperfection, not to what the theological tradition calls original sin, that in
Mm-hmm.
some fundamental sense we're lost or broken without the grace of God, even if we have some natural uh, points of orientation in our soul, as St. Thomas points out. But if you just say human beings denying imperfection, denying the reality of the drama of good and evil in each and every human heart and soul, and if you locate evil in bad systems,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
in the outer world, well, if only you get rid of those who are said to be ontological evil, the bourgeois, the merchants, the aristocrats, the Christians, the Jews, with some versions of the new racialists, whites embody all evil, that kind of thing. You are, in effect, inviting a tremendous amplification of terror and tyranny
Mm.
because you're mislocating the sources of injustice and imperfection. And I would add, in progressive church circles, there's definitely been a movement from, it's one thing to criticize social injustice or political tyranny or gross acts of oppression, but it's another thing to adopt a kind of ideological and liberationist project which sees evil in bad social systems and doesn't call human beings to repentance.
Yeah.
And so there can be ideological proclivities or currents within the Christian world itself.
Yeah.
I generally call that progressivist Christianity. One other fundamental trait that I introduce right at the get go in the book, um, I would say that traditional Christian and classical wisdom, and even some currents of the modern Enlightenment, distinguished in a very common sense but truthful way between good and evil.
Mm.
And I would say progressivist and ideological currents replace that sempiternal distinction between good and evil with an essentially ideological distinction between progress and reaction.
Mm.
And when you say people are reactionary, you're really saying they're an obstacle to the movement forward of the human race. And again, that lie, that denial of the real sources of human imperfection, that opens up terror and tyranny as an instrument for getting in the or cancellation.
Mm-hmm.
But as I say in the book, cancellation may seem soft compared to being sent to the gulag, but it's based on the same premise that we get those people out of the way,
Mm.
then our ideological projects can begin to transform the human condition.
Dan, you touched on this, and that was a fantastic kind of unfolding of things. So, when I was starting to read years ago about ideology, especially as it manifested itself in some of the terrible movements of the 20th century, I kept coming across John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau on one side and Edmund Burke on the other. And I want to see if I'm getting this correctly. And also we think about our Catholic background as well, about the notion of original sin and the need for repentance and humility and grace outside of our own means and so on. But the one thing among these political philosophers, if you will, or these political thinkers of Locke and Rousseau on one side and Burke on the other, was I got the vibe or the understanding that it was in Locke and Rousseau's philosophy that there was some sort of notion of an original state of kind of purity and innocence, if you will. And we're not talking about prelapsarian, but we're talking about just that there was this state of nature that was sort of perfect, if you will, and that it was ultimately the introduction, as you said, of kind of man's and women's institutions that basically went corrupt. And the bottom line is we can always find our way back to that perfect state if we go through the revolution of changing those institutions, eradicating the wrongdoings of the people that are operating those things, and we'll find our way there. Whereas Burke was of the mind, as a Catholic himself, of the mind that we're kind of got the original sin baked into us. It is not, and by the way, our institutions themselves are fallible in part because they're made up of human beings that are fallible. And so any projects like the French Revolution, which he really took to task in his reflections on the revolution in France, was a fool's errand that was going to result in terror because you would never be able to eradicate the evil you're trying to eradicate. So am I correct in understanding one idea of the fixability of the problems that can lead us back to a heaven on earth, and the other being it's unfixable on this side of the grave. Let's be a little Hippocratic and first do no harm. Am I understanding that kind of correctly?
Oh, I think that's broadly quite correct. I would say this that the notion of the state of nature, which was the founding heuristic of political modernity, is a deliberate and self conscious substitute for the account of the fall in the Garden
Mm,
of Eden. And it's also a self conscious substitute for Aristotle's account that man is naturally a zoon politikon, a political animal, which means we're a political and social animal born to live with others. And in a way, there's no such thing as individuals because everyone is a member of a family
yeah.
and a political community. Aristotle famously says he who is outside a political community is either a god or a beast. You know, God has a certain
Mm,
self sufficiency, although
mm,
we Catholic Christians believe, that Trinitarian love is a deep form of friendship and community. But in any case, yes, I think that's right. Now, um, what's you had to bring in one other figure here, Thomas Hobbes, who
yes.
certainly didn't believe that human beings by nature were timid, cooperative, and sociable, but he did believe that right and wrong were the product of the social contract
Mm,
that got us to leave the state of nature. In the state of nature, all is fair. Everyone has the right to preserve themselves. Hence, there's no injustice in killing or stealing that apple rather than sharing it with your neighbor. Um, so, an extreme social contractualism that or an artificialism
mm,
or
mm,
conventionalism that says good and evil. In a way, sometimes people say Hobbes is a natural right thinker because we have a right to preserve ourselves. And if we use our reason, our kind of utilitarian faculties, we'll conclude we're all better off in a political community under Leviathan where we pledge to obey the law and respect property. That way we won't be bumping each other on the heads. But is that natural right? I would say, in a more fundamental sense, there is no natural right
mm.
with Hobbes because um, everything is licit until the convention or contract that forms political community. Locke's a little trickier because he does say we have an obligation to respect the lives and property of others, even in the state of nature. But he adds, unless it comes into contradiction with your own self-preservation.
Hmm.
Well, Locke knew that in the state of nature, life was solitary, nasty, brutish, and short, to quote Hobbes.
Mm-hmm.
And Rousseau, I think, especially in his great and enigmatic, I say great, not that I endorse its
Yeah,
premises,
yeah.
but great because it's a work of ingenious political philosophizing. Rousseau is the one who emphasizes, and also in his second discourse on inequality, he recognizes that the human beings are pure plasticity or historicity,
Hmm.
that the nature of man is precisely the history of man. And where does evil come from? The first person who put down a claim to a piece of property
Hmm.
and introduced the notion of mine and thine, introduced a terrible curse into society. Believe it or not, Rousseau was a lot more moderate than Marx because he understood once you had civil society, you needed private property
Hmm.
and the rule of law. Unlike Marx, who thought somehow you could have some flourishing of humanity without private property. I should add the popes. Everyone's talking about Pope Leo the 13th and 14th. Leo the 13th was a great defender of private property. He didn't
Hmm.
want to abolish it. He wanted to make sure the working class and the poor had it.
Yes.
And he didn't want to abolish property, family, nation, or religion, the four abolitions of Marxism. Far from it.
Yeah.
And maybe we should read his other encyclicals on socialism and all of that, instead of turning him into a new dealer. But 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 in any case, yes, I think it's fair to say, especially Rousseau.
Hmm.
Uh, Most readers will not know. You have to sort of be a serious student of Rousseau, but Rousseau had a big dispute, an epistolatory dispute with Archbishop Beaumont of Paris in the 1750s. Christophe Beaumont was a very smart man, and he asked Rousseau, "Where's original sin?
Hmm.
Where's human imperfection? Where's the need for God's grace?" Rousseau, who's a more subtle thinker than you might think, but Rousseau adamantly denied the reality of human brokenness, wickedness, original sin. These were all products of historical development. They were all products of unjust social arrangements. And that's a very, very radical move. That's a
Yeah. Yeah.
break with the entire wisdom of the Western tradition.
Which, by the way, highlights the notion that which I learned late in life, that when you read philosophers and they seem sometimes turgid and dense and unapproachable, and what's the relevance of this? We're talking about mindsets, and that can fit into the whole ideological conversation, where you have a splitting off, and it starts at certain points, and downstream that splitting off is a massive, massive shift from where you would have gone if you would have said, no, I do agree in the natural notion of original sin, as opposed to man is sinless and it's institutions that corrupt, and we can fix those institutions, and where do we go from there? Dan, I want to ask you. So when I was thinking about how would I answer this, my own question about what is ideology, and I knew you would give the way better answer, which of course you did. But part of what I kept coming back to was the notion of a little bit of a prefabricated program, if you will, a fixed lens through which one is supposed to look at the world, such as class struggle with Marxism, racial hygiene with National Socialism, the oppressor oppressed dialectic of the woke / critical theorist side of things. And to craft this lens, from the way I was thinking, requires an undermining of existing beliefs and values. So the fight against the nature of man and woman, a long march to infiltrate and dominate the civil and legal infrastructure, a demand for uniformity, a Girardian scapegoating, and a ruthless punishment in the form of social stigma, economic isolation, legal persecution, physical harm of the recalcitrant souls. Now, I know that's clunky, and that's an enumerated list of things that I would put into my recipe for ideology, but is that a fair collection of notions
It's
surrounding?
100% accurate, and I would say these sort of practical side effects of the ideological impulse or project are they flow inexorably. Every lesson you write flows inexorably from that initial denial of enduring human nature,
Mm.
denial of the drama of good and evil in each and every soul, from the fundamental and false foundational distinction between progress and reaction instead of good and evil. I would add more fundamentally, once you replace the common sense notion, sober notion that our job is, to constrict evil in the world, and that means constrict evil in our own hearts,
Mm-hmm.
and to reform, as Edmund Burke said, conservation presupposes reformation.
Mm.
We've got to reform to conserve,
Mm.
but we've also got to reform. Works both way. We conserve through, in part, through reformation, and we reform partly by conservation. Churchill understood. Excuse me. Chesterton understood
Yeah.
this too. This mixture of tradition and reform, which is very different than the revolutionary spirit, which wants to negate, repudiate, sweep away. And yes, I think all of the traits you laid out are fundamental traits of the ideological mindset. And what they make clear is, and I insist on this point, the only way of truly applying these ideological nostrums are totalitarian.
Mm.
Precisely because, as I said before, each and every one of them is coercive, and each and every one of them is fundamentally totalitarian. It necessitates totalitarian methods to try to implement it. Now, I don't think these totalitarian efforts will ever succeed because there really is an enduring natural order of things and an enduring human nature. The Latin poet Horace famously said, "You can throw nature out the front door," and he meant human nature, but it will always come back to the back window. Mutilated, distorted, wounded. The Soviets and the Maoists and the Castroites and the North Koreans, and they never succeeded in creating the mythical new man of ideology. But they did a new Adam, but they did brutalize and spiritually undermine the old Adam. But it is interesting, at the beginning of the ideological project, in the 19th century, and then again in the middle of the 20th century, very lucid, intelligent, penetrating critics of totalitarianism. I think of two, Hannah Arendt and George Orwell. They feared that human nature might be conquered. I think
Mm.
that's the whole
Mm.
import of, Winston Smith at the end of 1984 loving Big Brother. Does he really love Big Brother, or is he in that, drinking bad gin and that has he been beaten down to say he loves it? But Orwell has that very dramatic image he presents us with of the boot of despotism on
Mm.
the human face forever.
Mm.
And in her concluding remarks in her 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which was the first major philosophical effort to come to terms with the novelty of totalitarianism, not an ordinary tyranny after all. Hannah Arendt said, "Human nature is at stake."
Mm.
I think people like Solzhenitsyn and Vogelin and Camus and others didn't really think human nature could be conquered completely, but they thought it could be abused and mutilated in dark ways. Solzhenitsyn of the Gulag Archipelago speaks about uh, lying and betrayal becoming forms of of existence.
Mm.
And Solzhenitsyn always said the lying, the systematic mendacity about everything, was far worse than the political repression or even the violence, because It asked an active participation in your soul in asserting that which was untrue.
Mm.
And I don't mean lying like each side in a political side exaggerates the limits of the others. I don't mean lying, around a garden variety. I don't even mean Machiavellian lying. I mean lying where you claim things that are so at odds with human experience, with common sense, with what we know in our bones. You just lie about everything. This is why Shewon Miłosz, who I mentioned before, the author of The Captive Mind, a great Polish poet, said communism was a logocracy, the
Mm.
rule of words. But he went by that as this language is invented. It misdescribes, misinterprets the whole of reality. And only by forcing everyone to participate in that web of linguistic lies can you keep together a system that is based on fundamental falsehood.
So I want to ask you specifically about this system based on fundamental falsehood, and you've mentioned Shewa Miłosz several times, and I want to quote him where he says, "In a room where people unanimously maintain a conspiracy of silence, one word of truth sounds like a pistol shot." So that's the first thing. Why the first question, and I'm going to give you a second question that we could wrap together. Why does ideology so fanatically and ruthlessly fear the truth? That's the first question. The second one is that most ideologies want to eradicate the past, like a type of non foundationalism, or warp it to their designs. So, progress or the way of the future are among the most popular mantras. And I know C.S. Lewis kind of described this kind of tendency as chronological snobbery. And as you remember, Chesterton muttered, "I've long ceased to argue with people who prefer Thursday to Wednesday because it is Thursday." Um,
Think
so what is it about?
it'd be so good with those
I
four.
mean, it's depressing for any writer to realize that Chesterton said it before you and better than you every time.
Oh,
So
I love Democracy of the Dead.
yes, exactly,
Tradition is the Democracy of the Dead.
exactly. So what is it about idea? What is it about the past and its principles, and what is it about the truth that is so damned threatening to ideology?
Well, I think ideology implicitly rejects the givenness of things, the natural order of things, God's creation, natural law, right reason, all those beloved formulations that we Catholics and other people of goodwill used. The idea that we had a fundamental reason to be grateful. You mentioned John Locke before.
Mhm.
John Locke says in the fifth chapter of his second treatise on government, we often think of John Locke as a very moderate thinker because, he laid the groundworks for separation of powers and constitutional government. But there was a radical side of Locke, too.
Mm-hmm.
He's no Rousseau, but he partakes of the spirit of modernism, political and philosophical. But John Locke said 9/10 of what we have comes from human labor.
Mm.
And then a sentence later, he says, nay, 99/100th.
Mm.
And a sentence later, he says, nay, 999 out of 1,000th come. Industrious, rational human beings create the world. Nature is niggardly. It is ungenerous. Well, if that's the case, you're hardly going to encourage a spirit of gratitude for the givenness of
Mm.
things.
Mm. Mm.
The French political thinker Bertrand de Jouvenel, who I've written on in a book called Sovereignty and Inquiry into the Human Good, has a beautiful affirmation where he's criticizing Rousseau and siding with Burke, and he says, this is the beginning of wisdom. The
Mm.
wise man knows himself for debtor.
Mm.
You know, that's the fundamental divide. Is the proper response of the human person to be grateful for the immense gifts that have been given to us, or are we to be impatient, revolutionary, angry, petulant? Are we is our fundamental stance to be that of revolt? And by the way, the first stance, the wise man knows he is debtor, does not demand that we are quiescent, that we ignore tragedy or injustice, but it means we reject the moral nihilism and intellectual nihilism that undergirds all revolutionary and ideological projects.
Mm,
And so I think um, there's something profoundly spiritual at stake here,
hmm
and it is that's why I have no time of day for certain kinds of liberation theology and progressivist Catholicism, because they begin with the same impatience, the same anger, the same, well, the same desire to create a different world,
Yeah.
and to say we can feed the poor. Even there, they don't do very well, because the preferential option for the poor often means endorsing political and social arrangements that keep the poor poor. It's one thing to speak about the poor all the time, but if you don't know how to help them, that's a bit of a problem.
Yeah.
So, you know, uh, but in any case, I'll leave it at that for now.
That's very good. It's funny. I recently, well, I won't go into that, but I saw a movie recently that highlighted it was the Padre Pio movie that highlighted Padre Pio's, you know, inner space, interior space, where he's never quite he's attending to the parishioners and the community through the sacraments and so on. But meanwhile, out in the streets, there's the movement for the communist uprising against the fascists that are emerging out of the post-war scenario and so on. And it reminds me a little bit of the notion that when John Paul II and ultimately Benedict XVI were quite critical of liberation theology, the twinning of faith with politics never turns out well. And that the interior space for faith and the revolution of the heart of what it means to be a sinner constantly in need of salvation is something that so far transcends a social program, that to cheapen it by not making it saying it can inform us doing good things and having a more enlightened, a better and a more courageous society and so on, but that one should never confuse faith with politics when it comes to that kind of thing, that we're
And by the
rendering.
way, I do think the Christian is obliged to be a good citizen.
Yep.
Augustine makes this point very well, most famously in chapter 19 of The City of God. Thomas, of course, makes this point in the treatises on the virtues and natural law. But the mistake is, and I think you hit the nail on the head, the progressivists more or less favor the abolition of inner space,
Mm-hmm.
the interiority of the soul. Everything for them is action.
Mm.
Everything is historically contingent. Everything, their focus is so on uh, the immaterialization of Christian hope that it's hard to see where God fits in,
Yeah.
and where the soul fits in, and there isn't a sufficient appreciation in these currents of the limits of justice.
Mm-hmm.
I would say this about most of the bishops when they talk about social justice. Read Aristotle's. They need to learn more political moral philosophy. Read Aristotle's Ethics. Aristotle says if everything's kept on the plane of justice, you're going to have a group of partisans, the rich, the poor, everyone else, making their claims with some justice, but there's going to be strife in the city because there isn't concord, there isn't forgiveness, there's not a stepping back. And Aristotle says even more important than justice is this politicae filia. It's friendship. It's we're in it together. We think of ourselves not just as a group of people making demands that are just. And so paring back on our claims, recognizing that we don't always see clearly, that the common good involves an adjudication of claims, less in the spirit of strict justice and more in the spirit of we're in it together,
Hmm.
of civic concord. It's a very important feature of the political common good. And I'm not sure in church circles today there's a sufficient appreciation of that point, which, by the way, was recognized not only by Aristotle, but by Thomas, by uh, Augustine, and by I think especially in the early social encyclicals from Leo to Pius the XI, Pius the XII, who didn't really write social encyclicals, but in his encyclicals, that's their warning against class struggle and hate and all of that, which was very, very real. We don't pay as much attention to that today. Um, they were more sensitive to the corrupting ideological dimensions of the modern project than we are. Oh, two great exceptions, I think, of course, Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, because of their life experiences
Hmm.
in Nazi Germany and Communist Poland, respectively, and because of their immense breadth and depth of social theological reflection. They they saw things that the dominant opinion in the West doesn't see today.
Dan, another thing about ideology is it seems bent on conforming reality into a preferred theory. So I once read someone writing about Marx dreaming up communism in the dusty stacks of the British Library, whereas the non-ideological Adam Smith went down to the marketplace and just witnessed exchange and recorded it. So Marx was dreaming up a theory that he wanted reality to conform to, whereas Smith seemed to be observing reality and then articulating a theory out of what he watched. What is the consequence of squeezing the square peg of reality into the round hole of ideology?
It's funny you say that. I'm reading a brilliant book from the mid 1950s by the Catholic French Catholic philosopher Gabriel Marcel, and he has a just an extraordinary chapter in the book on a critique of what he calls the spirit of abstraction
Hmm.
and how inhuman abstraction can be. Um, Taking your bearings not from lived experience and from a sensitivity, you might say, to the complexity of human reality, but imposing an ideological grid, a series of often murderous abstractions on the real world. You know, I think 9 out of 10 people, if asked about Marx, would say Marx saw social injustice in the factory system of the 19th century and responded to it. But if you read the early Marx, the Marx who defined communism in the German ideology as, I mean, by the way, we're going to have a dictatorship of the proletariat and violence. We're going to destroy the existing world. What's his definition of the positive content to follow? Well, hunt in the morning, fish in the
Yeah.
afternoon,
Yeah.
write criticism in the evening without becoming a hunter, fisherman, or critic. Pretty ill defined, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Max Weber in 1918 asked himself the question, how do you, with Marx and also Lenin's State and Revolution in mind, how do you have an unprecedented centralization of power?
Mm.
How do you use all the instruments of a coercive revolutionary state to go at your enemies? And how could anyone with a minimal appreciation of human nature realize that that damn instrument of coercion is not going to wither away?
Yeah. Yeah.
If
Yeah.
anything, every effort will be made to augment it. And of course, they didn't have a adequate view of human nature. In a way, they didn't believe in human nature
Yeah.
since everything was historical or sociological. They believed in external socioeconomic determinants, and bad people.
Mm.
Eliminate both, and all will be well. I think, along with the, yeah, I think. To go back to Vogelin's beautiful phrase about the forcible imposition of second realities, if these second realities are in fact fictive, if they're not in accord with the nature and need of human beings, the only way of putting those square pegs into the circles is through terror and tyranny.
Mm.
And that's why, as I quoted before, Solzhenitsyn thought, whether it was in China or Tibet or Cuba, East Asia and Korea, East Europe, the Soviet Union, the project always used the same methods. The one party state, the vicious persecution of religion, which of course taught a different. He reminded us not only of transcendental realities and and you might say the desire of the soul to commune with God, the providence of God, but it also reminded us of the Ten Commandments, the which are in some ways the foundation of the natural law. The law written on the hearts of men, as Paul puts it in Romans 2:15. So you have to throw all that out. You have to
Right.
throw all that out, and you have to declare war on human nature and human beings. Tocqueville also warned in his book, The Old Regime and the Revolution, and his memoir, The Souvenirs or Recollections, that a little less heavy handed. I mean, the full scale ideologists and revolutionaries I want to destroy human nature, come what may, and create a new man. But Tocqueville thought that soft, liberal, progressive intellectuals who often saw, the old French phrase, pas d'ennemis à gauche, no enemies to the left. He said they were addicted to what he called literary politics. You have societies that are imperfect, like all societies, but you also have many good things. In France, the Christian religion. Burke said in the Reflections, France was a despotism in appearance, but not in reality. When you got the French encyclopedists unleashing their whole nihilistic revolutionary project on Thinking France with the full support of the censors, this is hardly a totalitarian regime, right? But I think Tocqueville said the French philosophers and the intellectuals who followed in their place, he said they practiced a literary politics. He said it was like they were writing a play or a drama. And they would like, wouldn't it be good to have this? Wouldn't it be good to have this? Wouldn't it be good to have this? Wouldn't it be good to abolish this? They saw none of the tensions inherent in social life. They replaced the practical reason beloved of Aristotle and Thomas, with um, a kind of idea of just creating ex nihilo, drawing a pretty picture, writing a pleasant play. Now that may not have led to the kind of totalitarian democracy that we first saw in Jacobin France and subsequently in Marxist regimes, Nazism, and in other ideological revolutionary movements, but it led to an absolute inability to think seriously about public life. In other words, I would describe the alternative. Of course, there's anti totalitarianism where we reject the whole ideological temptation. Then I would say there's a distinction between moral realism, not Machiavellian realism, moral realism that takes the soul and its needs very seriously indeed, but also understands the limits of our ability to write a pretty play and have the outcome we want and pretend that recalcitrant human beings are not the stuff of social and political life. So those are really three different categories: the full-fledged ideologist, the moral and civic realist, and then in the middle, the kind of mushy, literary, sentimental, pas d'ennemi à gauche, intellectual. And Tocqueville's so funny in the recollections because he describes running into a friend of his named Ampere, who he said was a wonderful human being, but he said he had one fault. He got giddy and sentimental over revolutions that always ended in bloodbaths. Oh,
Oh.
you know, you know, uh, And Flannery O'Connor, as you well know, Todd, had a few choice things, as did Walker Percy, about the dark sides of sentimentality.
Hmm. Yes.
Sentimentality is not a sufficient basis to build the common good. If anything, people can sentimentalize the morally unacceptable.
Yes. Segment 2: Robespierre, Marx, and Respectable Murder. In his essay, Politics in the English Language, George Orwell insisted, quote, "In our time, political speech and writing are largely the defense of the indefensible. Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind," close quote. In Mein Kampf, Hitler scribbled, quote, "The great masses of the people will more easily fall victim to a big lie than to a small one," close quote. And his minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, wrote, quote, "If you tell a big lie enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it," close quote. So, Dan, Robespierre championing the rights of man, Marx foreseeing the workers' paradise are examples of ideologues employing euphemism, spin, exaggeration to excuse the inexcusable violent means to achieve their possible ends. So, one question I want to ask is, why is ideology so well known for its crafty linguistics in deception both of others and itself?
Well, I think we already got to part of the answer.
Yeah.
Part of the answer is that since the human condition has a kind of integrity of its own, it has a structure.
Mm-hmm.
It has simply can't be manipulated at will. How do you cover that gap between persisting realities, including the persisting reality we can call human nature, and the claims of the ideology? I'm going to quote Bertrand de Juvenal again, who liked to say that um, the beginning of all evil in political reflection is to succumb to the myth of the solution.
Mm,
We're going to solve the human problem once and for all. That's the path of totalitarianism.
mm,
A sober, non ideological, but still morally serious politics knows there are a series of provisional settlements.
mm-hmm.
Burke has a very interesting phrase in the Reflections on the Revolution of France where he says, and this is what he's saying to his fellow opponents of the revolution: don't think if we defeat revolutionary France that all will be well in the world.
Mm-hmm.
New problems, new evils will arise. And his phrase was quite suggestive. He spoke about the inventiveness of wickedness,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and so all the I think these linguistic categories, they're in part necessary to convey the utterly false claim that the human problem has already been solved,
Yeah.
or it's already in the process of being solved. It's it's no, I don't think the human mind works that way. People are still capable of seeing the disparity between
Mm-hmm.
mendacious claims and recalcitrant reality. But people like Orwell have done such a good job of showing the mechanisms by which people try to keep ahead of the recognition of reality. That's the split between that's exactly newspeak and doublespeak
Mm-hmm.
do. You sort of see reality coming at you, but you linguistically manipulate things so it doesn't quite catch up with you. By the way, I should say that first quote from Orwell was a really elegant and clear, and Orwell's always lucid,
Mm-hmm.
summary of much of what we talked about in part one of our conversation.
Yeah.
He laid out the effects of the ideological project. The ones from the Nazis, Goebbels and Hitler, remind us that the big manipulative lie, lying in absolutely outrageous way, sometimes can have the paradoxical effect of making the unbelievable more believable.
Yeah.
And Hitler was the master the of that kind of lie. I recently read. I got a book in the mail, a very very well done book by two professors at Boston College on political rhetoric throughout the ages.
Hmm.
And it was very well done. The selections were very well done. It used classical categories to distinguish between different rhetorical techniques. But in the section on the rhetoric of totalitarianism, it was quite striking. I think it's early 1940, late 1939. Hitler is blaming the German invasion of all of Europe on the Jews.
Hmm.
And he's announcing that the Holocaust. Of course, it wasn't a year or two later that it was officially proclaimed at the secret conference at Wannsee outside Berlin. But
Mm-hmm.
he is already, the big lie is allowing him to say the Jews did it and therefore they must pay,
Yeah.
and announcing it to the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no logic there, but there's deep conviction there. But it's a twisted ideological mode of pseudo reasoning. I know we're going to get to Marx a little later, but Marx in the Communist Manifesto says, I have no obligation to respond to criticisms of communism made in the name of religion, philosophy, natural law, natural justice, etc. In other words, ideological modes of justification are so self contained that they don't listen to rebukes
Mm.
from reason. Eric Vogelin liked to say Marxism outlawed Socratic interrogation.
Wow.
What do I mean by Socratic interrogation? The natural kind of questions Socrates would ask. What about this? What is this? What do you mean by this? How can this be? What is justice? How, is that is this truth? When you forbid those questions, you tear asunder our humanity.
Yes.
That's the lie. That is the forced participation in the lie. Both Solzhenitsyn and Havel said is the most evil, insufferable, and insupportable feature of totalitarian ideology.
So let's talk a little bit about Marx. In his 1845 theses of Feuerbach, Marx reflected that, quote, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Close quote. So Marx, along with his ideological descendants, Lenin and Stalin, were determined, as it seems Eric Vogelin would say, to immanentize the eschaton, to bring utopia or heaven to earth in the here and the now. Does that aim in and of itself, and this is going back to what we're talking about with Locke and Rousseau and Hobbes versus Burke, if you will, but does the aim to immanentize the eschaton, to change the world, not just interpret the world, especially through that Marxist lens, is that what results in the impatience of the movers like Lenin and Stalin, like Hitler? Is that what results in the ruthlessness? And a corollary question is, what is it? How do you answer those who will argue that Marx's theory was good but was only badly applied?
That truly stupid claim I've been hearing from students for the last 50 years, and happy to address it in a minute. It's a truly stupid claim. All right. I wouldn't say that to a student's face, but
Yes. You're just thinking.
I can speak it as an abstract truth. Look, let me step back for a second. Yeah, uh, well, the point you raised right before Marx is being true in true in theory, but not in practice. Let's go back to the original. Just restate your
Yeah,
first
the original question was the notion of Marx's intent to change the world and not just interpret it, and if in effect to sort of, as Vogelin would say, immanentize the eschaton.
Yes,
Is that
yes.
the genesis of such impatience and ruthlessness in the ultimate implementation of the ideology, for instance, of communism?
I think it is. And let's go back a little bit to thesis 11 from the thesis on Feuerbach that you're referring
Yeah.
to. By the way, if you open the Marx Engels Reader or any collection of Marxist writings, the thesis and Feuerbach are about this big. It's a
Mm,
very
mm,
small
mm,
thing, but it's a very weighty and influential statement of Marx. I think the first thing we have to realize is what Marx means by change.
mm,
He doesn't mean, in almost every political campaign, people say we need change. I think when Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, his motto was the rather unimaginative change, change, change.
mhm,
But he didn't mean, or maybe some of his people meant some radical, redoing of the whole world. I mean, there was an element of that, but mainly this was political talk. Marx meant something more fundamental. And one way of getting at it is when some Marxists and certainly in Soviet ideological speech, there was a constant tendency to speak about the prehistory of the human race.
mm,
Everything that came before communism was prehistory. That's really saying man will only be man with a capital M, transformed by revolutionary socialism once the revolution comes.
mm,
So there is no ongoing human nature. There's only a radical revolution that so many things that would have been considered at the heart of our nature were, in fact, simply byproducts of unjust social structures or of material and sociological subdeterminants. Václav Havel spoke before the American Congress in February 2020, and he gave a very beautiful speech about the recovery of the human person and the end of the reign of lies. But he probably said the strangest thing from not his point of view, or maybe my point of view, but from the point of view of the ordinary congressman from the Midwest. He said, "Now we know that consciousness precedes being
mm,
and not the other way around."
mm, mm.
By which he meant, I mean, imagine these words being recited to a
Yeah,
joint
yeah.
session of Congress in February 1990. What he meant was the human mind, the human soul, the human spirit was not simply uh, epiphenomenal
Mhm,
reflection
mhm.
of social, material, and economic causes. The soul had an integrity of its own, moral and civic agency were real. The spiritual life of real is real. Marxism is based on a bed of lies.
Mm.
I think probably no one in the Congress knew that's what he meant, but that's what he meant, and that was a very liberating truth.
Mhm,
So yes, I to go back to your first point about changing the world and whether that mode of thinking led to the practical outcomes we associate with the ideological project, I would say yes, 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 yes. It's so false. It so misrepresents who the human person is. By the way, if you deny the reality of moral agency, of civic agency, of the soul, you are going to treat people as if they don't have souls. And
mhm.
that means you're going to treat them in ways that abolish the liberty and human dignity of human beings. It's as simple as that.
This is what's so striking to me about these movements, and I think you're putting your finger right on it. Um, the misapprehension of human nature in Marx and saying we can abolish religion, traditional family, private property, countries and nations, and all that. This fundamental misdiagnosis by people who are heralded historically as geniuses it's sort of like, is it any, and I'm making a point that's been made by you and thousands of others much smarter than I am, about how could things go wrong. We'll get some people in positions of great influence and authority, have a huge amount of people subscribe to their philosophy, and then put them in power and have them enact it, all based on a fundamental misdiagnosis of what it means to be human. Because I come back to Thomas Sowell saying, effectively, human beings are not blocks of wood to be moved about, and yet there is this notion that these soulless drones can be sort of patched over here, put over there. We can collectivize the farms. We could eradicate these scapegoat types of people, and we're gonna arrive in this utopia, and you just get stuck in hell and you never leave it. Am I overstating my case?
No, I think at the core of the ideological movement, certainly in power, is social engineering.
Yeah.
If you look at the demography of communist criminality, you know, um, probably, the Black Book of Communism's
Mm.
estimate of 85 to 100 million people dying at the hands of communism is I think, too small. It's based on very conservative use of the Soviet archives, etc. Probably closer to 120, 140 million. But that said, the the majority of people, I mean, tens of millions died in the camps, hundreds of thousands, millions of religious believers were shot. Um, there were a multiplicity of means in repressing real or imagined opposition. But the majority, or certainly a significant plurality of the victims of communism were peasants.
Mm.
40 million or so during the Great Leap Forward in China. If you put together the deaths from collectivization and famine in Ukraine, but not just in Ukraine, Kazakhstan lost a third of its population between 29 and 34. Millions of Russians died in the Kuban and the Volga region. 5 to 7 million had died during the first war communism a decade earlier, when Lenin, not Stalin, requisitioned the grain from the farmers. How are they supposed to produce
Yeah.
when you take away everything they work? So without incentives, without love of their own, without a plot of ground to call their own, without the village community with the church at its centerpiece, that way of life, we have to realize collectivization was an assault on the church as
Mm.
well as the Russian and Ukrainian peasantry. And it was an act of pure destructiveness.
Yeah.
And it was all based on this ideological preference that the communists had for the workers over the peasants. And they distrusted peasants because they knew peasants peasants lived in families and communities. They were religious minded, not perfect. A
Mm.
lot of them drank too much. Some of them beat their wives occasionally. Not, but they were human beings with all the strengths and imperfections. A lot of heroism. We saw that when they stood up to the NKVD and the collectivizers. Um, People of faith, and their way of life was destroyed. Solzhenitsyn says it was the greatest crime of the Soviet regime.
Mm.
But I don't think most workers believed in those four abolitions that Marx talks about: abolition of private property, family, religion, nation. But the peasantry most certainly did not.
Mm.
And so, as Solzhenitsyn points out, the Soviet Union was based on the lie that the vast majority of people would crush a small group of exploiters. But the people wanted the very things that the ideological regime were committed to abolishing. And so that was another big lie, that this was somehow every revolutionary regime in the 20th century called itself a democratic republic or a
Mm-hmm.
people's republic. When you hear
Mm-hmm.
those terms, run for the hills, run for the hills. The People's Republic of Poland was nothing of the sort.
Yeah.
Uh, um, And Poland was the worst case because the accident of a very powerful Catholic Church kept a sort of check. Things were very bad in the first 10 years, but it was a gray, decayed, unaccountable Communist Party dictatorship. They did nasty things. They held the country back, but you had a Catholic Church which remained firm. You even had the one independent university behind the Iron Curtain, the University of Lublin, where Pope John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, had taught phenomenology and philosophy. So, but in any case, yes, the project is inherently totalitarian, and it's blind in a fundamental way to the needs and concerns of ordinary people.
Hi, I'm Todd Warner, Managing Editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3. 1989, The Annus Mirabilis and Beyond. In The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, Daniel Mahoney writes, quote, "The events of 1989 were the end of a 200-year cycle of total revolution, inaugurated by the French Revolution and, quote, perfected by Bolshevism and its offspring, that is, Maoism, Castroism, Pol Potism, in the 20th century. The revolution of 1989 was a decisive repudiation that many on the militant left would like to erase. Crucial lessons about the 20th century have sadly not been passed on to young people in any serious or significant way," close quote. So Dan, explain to us, I remember, being in my, social studies class at the time, and we're watching the TV as the bricks are falling or the stones are falling from the Berlin Wall. And that was the beginning of the revolution of communism falling apart in Eastern Europe, and then ultimately in Soviet Union in 1991. But explain to us what happened in 1989 and why was it considered such a repudiation of these dark ideologies?
Well, even the French Revolution begins in 1789. The Soviet Revolution, or at least that would take another year or two for things to unfold in the Soviet Union. But there's a perfect symmetry.
Yeah.
1789, 1989. The ideology of the lie had played itself out. It is true that the French Revolution had, at the beginning, some moderate elements. There was a man named Mounier, Joseph Mounier, Mounier, not to be confused with the 20th century Mounier, the editor of Esprit. But Mounier was a monarchien. The monarchien wanted an English-style constitution, a constitutional monarchy. And they tended to quote Charles II, the Baron de Montesquieu, better known as Montesquieu. His great book, The Spirit of the Laws, one of the sanest books of the French Enlightenment. Montesquieu was wary of revolutionary fanaticism, and he rightly said, power must check power. And he saw that at work in the Constitution of England. But by August of 1789, the monarchiens were out. So the idea of turning the French monarchy into a constitutional monarchy with a functioning parliament or three estates and building on what France had was thrown out the window. And there were reasons for this. I mean, the Estates General had not met since 1614. Imagine like the legislature of Tennessee meeting in 1814, and next a meeting in 1989. I mean, that's a long time.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean France wasn't free or didn't have elements of freedom, because it had town governments, it had some provinces, a few that had genuine provincial liberties. But it had a lot of intellectual dissent. We just have to say the philosophe or the
Mm.
encyclopedist. I mean, it was fashionable in France to hate the church. What did Voltaire famously say? Écrasez l'infâme. Let us crush the infamous thing.
Mm.
Um, so the French Revolution quickly morphed into, I'm going to call it, with due care for language, a proto-totalitarian
Okay.
revolution. It was not full-scale totalitarianism, but its aspirations increasingly took on a totalitarian character. How? You had the desire to radically break with the past. So after the flight to Alhen, when the king finally he's a prisoner, he and his family prisoner, they almost escaped 60 miles from the border. They're in prison, and soon there'll be a trial, they're executed, and the revolution begins a new phase. When a republic is declared, the French do something uh, very troubling. They declare the Second Republic, and they declare it to be founded in the year zero.
Hmm.
That was a frontal assault on history,
Yeah.
a frontal, we in the church like to speak about the hermeneutic of continuity, the idea that we see we pay attention to our forebears. Burke famously said that political life itself, civilized social existence, is a great contract between the living and the dead and the yet to be born. Of course, he posited that in contrast to year zero thinking. Everything in the past is antiquated. Charles Péguy, the late 19th, early 20th century French thinker, once said about the attitude of the French revolutionaries, everything was darkness till January 1st, 1789, and then there was light,
Mm.
electricity. That was the mode of thinking. And
Yeah.
of course, they changed the days of the week. They got rid of the Christian Sabbath, 10 days in the week, and they had this 10th day called the Decadi, which is a replacement for Sunday. But even Robespierre would complain that people would just go to the taverns and get drunk. So then he had to invent more about the religion of reason and all of this, and so there was that self-conscious break with everything that came before, especially the Christian religion. Um, and there was a terroristic frenzy against real or imagined enemies of the people, including class enemies, the aristos and priests. Something like 27,000 people were arrested and guillotined in France. Many more were arrested, but 27,000 were guillotined.
Mm.
But the leading uh, genocidal act of the French revolutionaries was the crushing of the rebellion by the Catholic peasantry in the Vendée in the northwest of France. By about 300,000
Wow.
French Catholics were killed. The peasants began the revolution by sending a manifesto to Paris where they said, all we're asking is to get back the liberties we had under king and church.
Mm.
Isn't there some irony there?
Yeah.
And that was a scorched earth campaign to destroy, much like the Soviet efforts to destroy the peasantry. And then you had, after the overthrow, after the Reign of Terror, and the overthrow of Robespierre and Saint-Just and the others, then you have a directorate, you have some, but then it all culminates in Napoleonic dictatorship. Um, but the revolution, the totalitarian cat is out of the bag. So you had a guy named Babeuf who founded a movement called the Conspiracy of Equals. He was eventually executed for his revolutionary activities, but Booth's idea was that we were going to level everything.
Mm.
And that might be the next phase. James Billington, the former Library of Congress, wrote a book called The Fire in the Minds of Men. All the secret societies, the Masons, not all the Masons, but some of them, but various socialist, communist, anarchist groups proliferated in the 19th century. And especially the Revolution of 1848 took on a much more socialist cast.
Mm.
Then we had the rise of the Third International under Marx. They took their bearing from the Communist Manifesto of 1848, which Marx and his funder, Friedrich Engels. Friedrich Engels was a very nice man by all accounts. He lived in a menage a trois with two Irish gals, showed up at business meetings. People liked him. I'm not saying he led a morally choice-worthy life, but
Yeah.
he wasn't a mean, autocratic man. And Marx would write him letters saying, I need more money. I need more money. And meanwhile, Marx knocked up the maid and caused miserable. He needed a maid, because he was a bourgeois at heart. And he immense chaos, moral chaos in his household. So, and then, these revolutionary movements, some mix of anarchism, Marxism, egalitarianism, and I would say just raw nihilism. And the nihilist wing was quite dominant in Russia, where the goal was simply to destroy everything. And you'll remember I think chapter 7 of my book is on Dostoevsky's demons, because Dostoevsky, better than anyone before or after, captured that spirit of revolutionary negation, the hatred, the urge to destroy. It's Shagalyov was one of the most fanatic of the revolutionary. They're socialists, but with an emphasis on nihilistic negation and destruction. But he says, we've got to level everything. We've got to cut off Cicero's tongues. We've got to, he talks about Cicero, he talks about Shakespeare, but it's cutting off tongues, gouging out eyes, cutting off hands, preventing the excellent from doing their work, speaking their truths, writing their masterpieces. And one character in Dostoevsky's Demons says, if we succeed, there will be 100 million people who perish. Dostoevsky was literally
Prophetic
on that point. And then, of course, Marxism, and many claim to be a scientific doctrine, but in practice, it contained much of the nihilistic, of the enthusiastic, of the millenarian. So the mixture of so-called scientific socialism with this neo-nihilistic desire for destruction and negation, that all comes together in Leninism and the events of 1917. And then in the subsequent derivations of Marxist-Leninism, Maoism, Castroism, Kim Jong-ilism, Pol Potism. And then, of course, there's Nazism. The Nazis are much less interested in changing human nature. They just understood nature, human nature, I would say, biologically, vitalistically, zoologically. In other words, they wanted the survival of the fittest.
Yeah. Dan, I want to ask you, the French Revolution, as you've mentioned, ended in Napoleonic despotism. The Nazi and Japanese imperial ideologies ended in the ruins of the Second World War. The Bolshevik Revolution lay moribund in the collapsing European and Soviet states of 1989 and beyond. the one comeback people said to, whoever, I think it was Lenin had said it or somebody else that said, to make an omelet, you need to make eggs, or you need to break eggs. And then someone said, yeah, but at least where's the omelet? So it seemed like there was a lot of egg breaking in all of these revolutionary ideological movements there that was horrible and never justified, but there was never any omelet that came out of any of them. And so my question is, why haven't these monstrous movements and their emphatic defeats warded off everyone from the seduction of a resurgent ideological excess that we see even today?
Well, I think we have to go back a little bit to the lost promise of 89 here. Very few people understood the anti totalitarian revolutions of 1989 and their forebear, the Hungarian, the glorious revolution of 1956, as Hannah Arendt called it in a 1958 essay. We tended to talk about the victory of markets over planning. True, but not the essence of things. We tended to talk about, the victory of Western arms over Eastern arms. We tended to um, not see that this was deep meaning of 1989 was the comprehensive defeat of the lie, the self destruction of the lie.
Mm-hmm.
And our lessons, Francis Fukuyama gave the most famous theoretical account, but even though he predicted the universal victory of a kind of Western model, but it wasn't certainly the old Christian states. It wasn't even, Churchill and de Gaulle saying, what are we fighting for in World War II? Christian civilization against Nazi barbarism. It was VCRs and consumer plenty and, yes, free elections, but based on a kind of tepid quasi relativism. I would say instead of the lessons that John Paul II or Havel or Solzhenitsyn drew, that this was the defeat of the lie, and in that sense, a victory of the human soul in '89. Um, we drew what I would call an Isaiah Berlin style. All those regimes believed in truth and tried to impose on them, and so people like Isaiah Berlin and much worse Richard Rorty said that this ours was a victory for relativism over absolutism. Well, that is the very wrong lesson to be learned.
Yeah.
And instead of reflecting on the evil and the murderous consequences of um, cancellation or class exclusion or guilt being rooted in ontologically in one group, we we gave no thought, as far as I can tell, in the 1990s to the great and terrible evil, which is ideological Manichaeanism.
Mm.
And it resurrected in the form of identity politics. And, there's a scholar, Joshua Moravchik, a Jewish scholar, written for commentary for many years, very thoughtful man. He wrote a book in the early 90s on the death of the socialist ideal. And he had put out a new edition about 4 years ago, and he had to say the rebirth
Hmm.
because he noted young people are more inclined to proclaim the justice and goodness and choice-worthiness of socialism or even Marxist Leninism than their predecessors 25 years ago.
Wow.
I mean, when do people learn?
Yeah.
But I think it's much harder to learn the truth about totalitarianism of the left than totalitarianism of the right. I think communism always gets the benefits of good
Hmm.
intentions. But I don't know what the good intentions are. Paradise or perfection on earth, maybe. But the four abolitions are hardly a good theory
Yeah.
or a morally choice-worthy way of life. And so, what a disappointment that 35 years after the destruction of European communism, so many of our contemporaries, especially the young, remain indulgent
Mm,
toward the enemies of civilization. It should not be. But on the center right, there was too much complacency, there was too much economism, there was a lack of thinking. And who paid attention to those who were sources of truth on this matter?
yeah.
Very few. I must say I'm among them, but very
Yes.
few.
Yes. Yes. Very true. Very true. Segment 4: The Resurgence of the Real. In The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, Daniel Mahoney writes, quote, "Between utopian mendacity and postmodern moral indifference lies this path of spiritual and political elevation that aims to bring together, slowly but surely, politics and conscience, freedom and moral self-limitation, with a healthy respect for human limits and imperfections. It is an arduous path that has nothing to do with false hopes and utopian illusions." Close quote. Dan, the ideologies of the 20th century were fractured by the courageous voices of religious and cultural dissidents. Pope John Paul II affirmed, quote, that God is the supreme guarantor of human dignity and human rights, close quote. Alexander Solzhenitsyn insisted, quote, even if all is covered by lies, even if all is under their rule, let us resist in the smallest way. Let their rule hold not through me, close quote. And intellectual Leszek Kolakowski spat, quote, the ideological fantasies of this movement, that was the New Left of the 60s, were no more than a nonsensical expression of the whims of spoiled middle-class children. And while the extremists among them were virtually indistinguishable from fascist thugs, the movement did without doubt express a profound crisis of faith in the values that had inspired democratic societies for many decades, close quote. So in after that hailstorm of quotes, Dan, why is it so important today to study these types of courageous figures and their ideas?
Well, to begin with, they are all great men, writers, and moral witnesses.
Hmm.
The truths that they proclaim, for example, how rare is it to understand the non subjectivist, non arbitrary character of conscience? Here, John Paul II and Solzhenitsyn, who also wrote very powerfully about conscience. There's a scene in the First Circle, one of the protagonists of the novel, an ex-Marxist and Epicurean named a diplomat named Inokenti Volodin, uh, after reading his mother's letters from another age where people took the true, the good, and the beautiful seriously, he says a great truth came over him. He said he used to think we only have one life to live, but now he realized we only have one conscience
Mm.
to respect and honor. And when Solzhenitsyn always meant by conscience something non-arbitrary, non-subjective. For John Paul II, for Solzhenitsyn, conscience was the bridge between politics and the soul. It was the way men in public and private life maintained integrity, honored the truth, and therefore brought their own gifts and witness to bear on the public square, a public square that in principle at least should be dedicated to freedom and dignity.
Mm.
Um, and, I think Kolakowski's remarks, um, really get to the paradox that so many people who claim to be progressives or populists or care for the people or be promoting a better world, in fact, adopted the most thuggish moral and civic bearings. I just published a piece in the June issue of the New Criterion a review of a 500-page book of Raymond Aron's critique of Sartre. The book is called Aron Critique de Sartre. And Aron comments that, Sartre could talk about existentialism and human freedom, but he was willing to posit violence against ordinary people as the mode of emancipation.
Hmm.
He was willing to defend a philosopher who was willing to defend the indefensible. Um, Sartre said we only have a modicum of community, of overcoming the hell which is other people through violence. He called it the group infusion, group infusion, made possible by fraternité terror. Fraternity terror.
Jeez.
In the book, I quote the Comte de Chambord, who said, "Be my brother, or I will kill you."
Jeez. Oh man.
Well, boy, this is not the Christian message.
No.
It is not the humane message. It is not. Now, what I want to do, I think what we need to do in any effort to recover the real is to take these profound insights that arose, they're the positive message or conclusions that rose uh, in reaction to these various projects of nihilistic negation and repudiation.
Hmm.
We mustn't ever forget the context, because those projects of nihilistic, revolutionary, moral, civic, political negation are a permanent possibility under conditions of modernity. But we need to take the positive context about the truth, about the structure of human nature, about the possibilities for the elevation of the soul when confronted by the requirements and demands of soul and conscience, and of the law written on our hearts by um, God. We need to take them, disinter them a bit from their negatively from their conscience, and show how they might become building blocks of a truly humane and morally superior democratic project. And I think John Paul II started to do that
Hmm.
in encyclicals such as Centesimus Annus or Evangelium Vitae. And again, this is not where Europe is going with its euthanasia bills
Hmm.
and its cult of autonomy. It's not exactly where we're going. Although I think in America, this vision still resonates with a lot of Christians and a lot of people of common sense and goodwill. But I would say the history there has been a resurgence of the real in the sense that the totalitarian project is self destructed. But the resurgence of the real in the more specific sense that, Horace's nature has come back through the back window,
Hmm.
that still needs to be informed and elevated by anthropological and Christian wisdom. And that's something I point to. I think the last chapter in my earlier book, The Idol of Our Age, on the humanitarian subversion of Christianity, was about, you know, renewing a notion of conscience, or what Pope Benedict XVI, in his speech to the Bundestag in 2011, had called recovering a moral ecology of freedom.
Yeah.
And there too, remember, he quoted Kings, the listening heart. What did Solomon want above all? The listening heart,
Hmm.
the moral and conscientious discernment to do the right thing. So this separation of democratic will, democratic choice or consent from the object, from the spirit, that which allows us to choose well and wisely.
Hmm.
That's at the heart of our crisis, which is a moral crisis. But I do think the same tools and insights that allow us to resist the ideological project will also allow us over the long term, because it's a therapeutic project in a way. We got to
Yeah.
recover,
Yeah.
we got to heal,
Hmm.
but will allow us to restore the moral foundations of democracy in a um, and that means reconnecting it to the truth about man. I love that phrase. Pascal had a version of it, Peggy had a version of it, and John Paul II had a version. But there is no democracy severed from the truth about man.
Mm.
And proclaiming autonomy, relativism. You'll remember I have a chapter in the book on the moral inversion where,
Hmm.
following Michael Polanyi, I argue fanaticism and moral relativism are two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
When we deny the ability of practical wisdom or reason to adjudicate moral goods, moral passion goes underground with nothing to judge it, instruct it, limit it, inform it, and it comes back as raging anger and fanaticism.
Mm. Dan, what's so wonderful about talking to you and reading you is how profoundly well read you are. And I just want to say, for those people out there that are kind of looking at what's been a crazy modernity with a lot of ideological pulls in different directions and so on. Um, I'll tell you, just for my last couple decades of reading and a lot of reading of what Dan has put out, whether it's like Solzhenitsyn, Václav Havel, Whittaker Chambers, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I think it's Alfred Delp, Leszek Kolakowski, but there's the Bernard de Juvenals, the Michael Polianis. Dan, you have such a list of people that are, some names are familiar to people, and then there are others that are second, third, and fourth tier outside of their wheelhouse. They've just never even come across them. So you and I are going to talk offline on how we can kind of get people informed as to some of the other readers. But specifically, I would highly recommend reading kind of anything that Daniel Mahoney puts out, but especially now, The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, which is a brief but comprehensive treatment of the totalitarian impulse then and now. You've been so generous with your time, Dan. I wanted to ask you one last question. You know, the propensity that humanity has to get sucked into ideological fervor again and again can be a little bit disheartening. Are you hopeful? Are you hopeful? Kind of going. Remember you saying that there was a little bit of despair, maybe in Orwell and Hannah Arendt, about whether or not human nature ultimately could be conquered by totalitarian ideology. Does hope still spring eternal in the heart of Dan Mahoney?
Well, boy, I'm not an optimist because I have a profound sense rooted in experience and reading and knowledge of history and philosophical reflection of how human beings can screw things up.
Hmm.
On the other hand, I am not convinced that the majority of human beings are indecent. I do believe we can learn slowly, but really from experience. And I don't think we need to have a guarantee of success to hold on to hope.
Hmm.
And I will remind people, and I really learned this from or I had read it in Thomas, but my friend Pierre Menant brought it to my attention. Thomas, I think it's question 91 in the Treatise on Natural Law, says that human free will, responsible action, moral, political, the exercise of the virtues is part of God's providence. Think about that for a second.
Yeah.
Um, we're not just waiting for the Holy Spirit to save us. We all from time to time say, God save us, and cry out to heaven. But we are part of God's providence,
Hmm.
instruments of God's
Hmm.
providence. We have to act,
Yes.
we have to do the right thing. I don't think we want hysteria. We don't want despair. We want hope tethered by realism, the moral realism of what I spoke of. And I think despair is among the worst of sins because it's an abdication of the role we play civically as citizens, but within, as I suggested a moment ago, God's own providential design.
Mm.
So we have to hold our heads up, we have to fight the good fight, and we have to have confidence that not in the spirit of self righteousness that we know everything, but in the spirit that there are fundamental truths that must be defended and articulated. And, and in the Western world, for all the moral decline, which is palpable, we still have instruments of self government. We still have instruments of civil society. We are still able to convert. We are still able to persuade. I wish the church, after 30 years now of talking about evangelization, would actually evangelize. Remember that Archbishop from Venezuela during the Amazonia Synod who said he'd never converted anyone to Christianity. He was too busy fighting climate change. Well, they did convert to Christianity. They became Pentecostalists. You know, so no, there's no reason for despair. But I will say this: uh, an exaggerated hope, a this worldly hope, can be the other side of despair. You expect too much, you expect too much quickly, and then you give up. So we need a certain solidity of soul that allows us to march forward, and we should never underestimate the gift of prudence. Um, Doing the right thing, thinking the right thing, exercising practical wisdom with our neighbors, as citizens, as participants in the intellectual and spiritual life. I think that does wonders. So um, uh, I'm not really giving an answer to your question other than to say I'm not, I hold on to hope. I never confuse it with optimism, and I reject active pessimism and despair.
Daniel Mahoney, professor, author, and enemy of the ideological lie. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, Todd.
So I've been thinking. In my conversation with Daniel Mahoney, something dawned on me, and it was dramatic, like a switch being flipped. As long as I can remember, I've been fascinated with totalitarian ideology. What is it about certain ideas like National Socialism, communism, modern secular fundamentalism, that cause its proponents not only to wield power, but to strive to control individuals down to their very soul? Why is simple authority not enough and ruthless totality the only answer? And what, in the end, does it take to achieve it? Daniel Mahoney helped me understand the answer. It is impossible to achieve total control over an individual. Impossible. You can degrade a person, imprison them, bind and torture them. Under the right amount of duress, you may even get them to confess or assent to anything, but you'll never possess their soul. Every person is a child of God, imbued with the kiss of ineradicable dignity. Every person is gifted with agency, the free will to hew close to the true or to deviate to the false. And for any ruler or system to insist that our nature is otherwise, that our free will is conditional, or that our souls are controllable, will only lead to heinous acts of inhumanity and unconscionable manifestations of barbarism. Time and again, ideology and its adherents make efforts to control and conform man's souls. But our blessed innermost natures, our very God kissed identities, ultimately refuse to budge. No matter the incessant and brutal efforts, that square peg of the human soul will never fit into the round hole of ideology. As Thomas Sowell once insisted, people are not inert blocks of wood to be moved about like pieces on a chessboard to carry out some grand design from on high. But ideologies don't like this answer and simply refuse to quit. Instead, they viciously employ what Solzhenitsyn dubs the twin pillars of violence and the lie. To be sure, totalitarian ideology is a study in darkness. It is fundamentally the devil striving to unmake man. But this intractable reality, the brilliant resilience of the human soul, is the stumbling block of totalitarians. Thankfully, the Catholic Church is the foremost champion of the dignity of each human being and the inviolability of the soul. So in every age, from the pronouncements of Caesar as God to the ideological fervor of the French Revolution, from the class utopia of the communists to the racial utopia of the Nazis, and finally to the modern secular ideologies that fracture us as children of God into a million shards of warped racial, sexual, or gendered identities, we can be assured of the hope that the Scripture, sacraments, and the saints forever come to the rescue of the soul. Thanks be to God. And one last thing. Take a deep dive into Dan Mahoney's The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, the Totalitarian Impulse Then and Now, but also explore two great works from dissidents in ruthless ideological regimes, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago and Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon. I've often found the bravery of such dissidents is twinned with a clarity about the evils of totalitarianism and the presence of a soul. It is dark reading, penetrated by brilliant shafts of truth. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.